In October of 1905, in Tokyo's Kanda district, Count Jiro Satake sat alone at a low lacquered table and reached for a porcelain teacup. The brass key was already turned in the lock, and the bolt had gone home with a clean metal click. 4 guards stood in the hallway outside under the yellow gaslight, watching the only door in or out. When they smashed that door open 1 hour later, the room was sealed, the chair was empty, and the tea was still warm enough to steam. Tonight, I'm going to tell you one true style story from an age that believed steel, schedules, and locked doors could keep chaos outside. It is a story about wealth, habit, and a room built so carefully for privacy that, in the end, it seemed to erase the man inside it. And under all of it, there is that one detail that never settles no matter how many times the file is reopened, because warm tea should not be waiting for a man who is no longer there. This story is meant to be heard late, with rain somewhere in the background and the rest of the house already asleep. If you enjoy strange, dark, and mysterious stories told slowly, go ahead and subscribe and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And for the like button, maybe pour it a careful cup of evening tea, set it down on the table, and then tap like before the steam has time to fade. Alright, turn the lights down, get comfortable, listen to the rain, and let's go back to a mansion in Tokyo where an industrial magnate kept one sacred hour for silence every evening. The house was built to resist thieves, rivals, and fire. What it could not resist, at least on that one October night, was a disappearance so clean it seemed to take place between one breath and the next. Count Satake was 58 years old that autumn, broad-shouldered, deliberate, and famous enough that newspaper artists liked to make his jaw look even harder than it was. He owned foundries, rail interests, warehouses near the Sumida River, and a piece of the future that much of Meiji Japan believed was already arriving on iron wheels. The clerks who worked under him said he could hear disorder in a ledger, the way other men heard a wrong note in a song. He lived inside routine with almost devotional care. Breakfast at the same hour, meetings arranged down to the quarter hour, a walk in the inner garden before dusk when he was home early enough to take it. His servants knew the sounds of his habits, the way sailors know tide marks on stone. When his sliding bath door closed in the evening, one maid in the rear corridor could tell the time within 5 minutes without ever looking at a clock. There were parts of him, though, that did not match the public image. He wrote short poems in a careful hand that almost no one saw. He kept pressed maple leaves between pages of Western engineering journals. He had a weakness for very delicate porcelain, especially pieces so thin that lamplight could pass through them around the rim. In a study full of safes, ledgers, and dark wood, those pale cups looked almost like an inside joke only he understood. His daughter Aiko saw a side of him most of Tokyo never did. She was 21, recently engaged, and one of the few people in the household who did not tighten her posture the moment he entered a room. That evening, a little before 6, she met him in the main corridor with a sheet of names for a formal dinner planned the following week. He listened with patience, asked whether an aging professor from Ueno had been included, and made a small mark beside the menu item he wanted reviewed later. She remembered him looking rested, which was unusual after a day of board disputes. He had spent the afternoon arguing with directors over Northern Rail expansion, freight capacity, and land rights, and men who left those meetings usually came out drained or irritated. Satake stepped out of it, almost untouched. When Aiko hesitated over one guest whose family had fallen from favor, he laid 2 fingers over the page, smiled very slightly, and told her kindness was often a better investment than pride. After that, he cut through the west veranda and took his brief evening walk in the private garden. Gravel shifted under his sandals with a dry whisper. A gardener trimming a pine branch bowed low, and the Count paused just long enough to ask whether the first frost had touched the outer wall beds yet. He stopped near the maples and looked at the red leaves for several seconds, not with the distracted glance of a busy man, but with the stillness of someone letting the day settle back into place. There was one more ordinary act before the night changed shape. On his way inside, Satake passed a junior clerk waiting near the records room with an ink-stained sleeve and a face gone pale over a copying error. Rather than dismiss the man, Satake took the ledger, turned 3 pages, corrected the entry himself, and handed it back without a lecture. The clerk would later repeat that moment to police again and again, as if the calm way the Count returned the book proved he could not simply vanish an hour later. At 6 o'clock sharp, as he did on evenings when he was home, Satake entered his private study for what the household called his quiet hour. No servant was allowed inside once the tray had been set. No interruption was permitted unless there was fire, news from the palace, or a matter involving immediate bloodkin. He nodded once to the 4 guards in the hallway, stepped over the threshold, closed the heavy oak door, and turned the brass key from the inside before sliding the bolt into place. The room was less grand than outsiders imagined. It was rectangular, windowed only by narrow high panes that had been fixed shut decades earlier, lined with bookshelves, and anchored by a broad desk near the inner wall. One iron safe sat behind a hanging scroll. Another smaller strongbox rested in a cabinet built into the paneling. The tea tray waited on a low table beside the chair he favored, and the lamplight gave the porcelain a soft skin of gold as the steam began to rise. He removed his outer robe and hung it over the back of the chair with the care of a man who wasted no motion. Then he sat, drew a document toward him, and picked up the calligraphy brush laid beside the paper. The brush paused above the page. He pressed the sheet flat with one hand, as he had done thousands of times in offices, private cars, and hotel suites from Osaka to Yokohama. It was the kind of small movement that seems to belong to an endless future, right until it doesn't. Satake poured the tea and listened to the thin ceramic note the liquid made when it touched the cup. The scent was green and earthy, mountain-grown, one of the expensive harvests he preferred in autumn. For a minute or two, everything in that room still obeyed the old rules. The lamp held steady, the books sat where books sit, the key remained in the lock. Beyond the door, 4 armed men stood close enough that he could have reached them in seconds if he chose to rise and open the room himself. Then something in the air changed. Not a noise, not a draft, not the hard impact of another person entering, but a pressure shift so local and so wrong that it made the hairs along his forearms lift. He turned his head toward the far shelves first, then toward the paneled wall by the safe. The lamp guttered once, shadows ran long across the books, and then drew back. Satake stayed still, one hand on the table, as if stillness itself might keep the room from changing any further. He tried to stand. His knees answered slowly, as though the floor had thickened beneath him. The silence that followed was different from the silence he came there to enjoy. This one had shape, it pressed against his ears and seemed to hold the room in place. He looked at the brass key in the lock and then at the cup on the table, as if the familiar objects might pin reality down long enough for his body to catch up to what his mind had already recognized as danger. You are sitting in a locked room that was designed to make danger impossible. The guards are inches away, the key is right there, and yet the space behind your shoulder feels larger than the room itself, like a seam has opened into something cold and measureless. You want to call out, but your throat locks before any sound forms, and the steam rising from the cup in front of you becomes the only thing in the room still moving as if the world is normal. Outside, in the hallway, Head guard Nakamura checked his silver pocket watch and frowned before he closed the lid with his thumb. The count was precise. If he asked for 1 hour, he emerged in 1 hour, not 3 minutes early and never 7 minutes late. At first, Nakamura thought the house had simply muffled whatever small movement was happening inside. Then he noticed the other men had grown attentive in the same quiet way. No page turned, no chair shifted, no cup touched a saucer. The silence had become too complete. At 7 Nakamura knocked with 2 knuckles and addressed the count through the wood with formal restraint. No answer came. He waited, then knocked again, louder this time. The guard opposite him moved closer and pressed one ear against the panel, listening for even the smallest human sound. What came back was almost nothing. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock was ticking. One of the younger guards swallowed hard enough for the others to hear it. Nakamura asked for the crowbar without raising his voice. The first strike cracked the frame. The second opened it. When the door gave way, the men rushed in, expecting illness, collapse, or attack. Instead, they stopped almost at once because the room was wrong in a quieter way. The chair was pulled back just slightly. Satake's outer robe was still draped neatly over it. The cup sat on the table with steam thinning above it. The key remained in the inner lock. The bolt had to be lifted from inside before the broken door could swing wide. And the Count himself was nowhere in view. Police from the Metropolitan Force arrived quickly, led by Inspector Hayama, a methodical man with a narrow face and a habit of removing his gloves whenever a case turned strange. He entered the study, stepped over splintered oak, and went first to the table instead of the walls. The tea was still faintly warm. The brush lay beside the unsigned document. There was no blood, no overturned furniture, and no sign that anyone had struggled with a man large enough to command a room simply by standing in it. Hayama worked outward from the obvious. He measured the floorboards, tested the paneling, and ordered every shelf cleared. Men tapped the walls inch by inch. Carpets were lifted. The underside of the desk was checked for latches. The ceiling was examined from the attic side. The narrow panes were inspected from both inside and outside, and showed no fresh damage, no cut seals, and no opening wide enough for a body in any case. The study gave back only solid timber, plaster, stone, and the unnerving logic of a room that should have made this impossible. He separated the guards and questioned them until dawn. None changed his account. No one had left the hallway. No servant, messenger, or relative had approached the door during the hour. One maid had carried hot water past the corridor earlier, and remembered hearing nothing beyond the faint sound of a cup being set down. A kitchen servant confirmed the tea had been prepared in the usual way and carried straight to the study by the same butler who had done so for years. No drug, powder, or unfamiliar scent was reported by anyone. The rest of the mansion was searched before the sun was fully up. Satake's slippers were still by the low table, angled toward the chair. His personal safe remained locked and untouched, which argued against a rushed theft or arrival after documents. Hayama checked the garden paths for bare footprints in the damp earth and found none. Gate records showed no carriage leaving during the relevant hour. The decorative ponds were sounded with poles. Storerooms were opened. Chimneys were checked. Every answer the house provided only made the central fact harder to hold. Late the next morning, a junior officer on a ladder noticed something pale on top of the tallest shelf near the north wall, a place no one would casually set anything and no one could reach without help. He brought down a single white glove. Household staff identified it as one of the Count's evening gloves, a pair he had worn earlier when receiving business guests. But the glove had been folded into the shape of a small bird. It was clean, sharply creased, and strange enough that the room seemed to contract around it when Hayama held it in his hand. That was the detail that shifted the investigation from difficult to haunted. Satake did not practice paper folding, much less the delicate handling required to shape cloth into something that neat. No ladder had been left in the room. No servant could explain why one glove would be up there while the other was nowhere to be found. Hayama sent for craftsmen, magicians, architects, and men who specialized in stage mechanisms. They examined the study from the practical side first, because the practical side is where responsible people go when a room starts behaving like a story. The grounds search lasted weeks. Paths were dug up, stone walkways were lifted, ponds were drained low enough to expose silt and broken pottery at the bottom. Workers traced old foundation lines looking for sealed tunnels or forgotten drains wide enough to move a body. Rivals in rail, steel, and shipping were watched. Political contacts were questioned. Servants' trunks were opened. Laundry carts were checked against delivery times. No ransom note came. No witness reported seeing the Count after he entered the room. Tokyo kept moving, and the space where Satake should have been stayed empty. The most conventional theory was that something had entered the tea, perhaps a sedative strong enough to drop him quickly and allow removal through some route not yet found. Laboratory analysis found only high-quality green tea and clean water. Another theory suggested a hidden ceiling panel sealed from above after the fact, but engineers brought in to inspect the roof declared the span uninterrupted and old, with no recent disturbance. The study had now been tested by guards, police, builders, and doubters, and still it behaved like a locked hand that refused to open. Years passed, and Inspector Hayama kept returning to the file. He revisited the mansion so often that servants began preparing a side table for him without being asked. Sometimes he sat in Satake's chair and looked only at the key. Sometimes he stood in the hallway with his watch open, replaying the last hour of the Count's known life, minute by minute. The one thing he never stopped circling was the simplest fact in the room, because warm tea and an empty chair make a combination that should not need interpretation, and yet there it was. I think that is what keeps certain cases alive longer than the people who worked them. Not the scale, not the wealth, not even the locked door. It is one ordinary object, refusing to behave like an ordinary object. On his deathbed, decades later, one of the original guards added a detail he had never placed in any official statement. A few minutes before the door was forced, he said, he had seen a faint blue shimmer beneath the threshold, brief as a match flare seen through fog. He had kept quiet because the house had no electrical wiring at the time, and because saying such a thing in a formal inquiry was a good way to be dismissed as frightened, drunk, or unstable. Hayama never heard that statement in life. Researchers found it only much later. Count Jiro Satake was declared legally dead 7 years after his disappearance. His businesses were divided among heirs, partners, and charitable trusts he had funded during his lifetime. The mansion remained in family hands for a while, but the study was sealed and eventually abandoned as a working room. No body was found, no confession surfaced, no credible mechanism was ever demonstrated. A man known for controlling weight, timetables, and material outcomes entered the safest room in his house, and the world failed to keep hold of him. In 2026, the old estate no longer stands as it did that night. The land has been folded into public space, and only fragments of foundation stone remain to suggest the scale of the house that once rose there. The case survives in historical files, marginal notes, copied diagrams, and the kind of argument that never quite ends, because no explanation has managed to satisfy the room itself. And on some evenings, people still claim the air near that ground carries a thin scent of green tea for no reason anyone can name. In July of 1907, the merchant vessel Caspian cut a steady line through the dark waters of the sea that shared its name. The heavy iron hull vibrated with the rhythmic beat of its steam engine as it carried a massive cargo of gold and crude oil toward the port of Astrakhan. The moonlight reflected off the oily surface of the water, making the wake of the ship look like a trail of liquid silver stretching back into the horizon. Captain Mikhailov stood on the bridge and adjusted his cap as he checked the compass, satisfied with the ship's progress across the calm inland sea. He was a man who lived by the clock, maintaining a strict schedule that allowed for no delays or deviations in the delivery of his precious cargo. His hands were calloused from decades of work on the water, and his eyes were sharp enough to spot a shifting current or a distant light long before his crew noticed a change. Below the deck, the engine room was a humid world of copper pipes and hissing valves where the stokers worked in a continuous cycle of shoveling coal into the furnaces. They communicated in short shouts and practiced gestures, their bodies moving in a synchronized dance that kept the heart of the ship beating with a deep and constant thrum. The heat was thick with the scent of burning coal and hot metal, creating an atmosphere that felt disconnected from the cool night. In the galley, the cook was finishing the preparation of a late-night meal for the watch officers, setting out plates of salt beef and fresh bread on the long wooden table. He moved with a quiet efficiency, wiping down the counters and ensuring that the coffee pot was kept hot on the stove for the men who would soon be coming off their shift. The kitchen was a place of familiar smells and domestic routine, providing a small sense of comfort in the middle of the dark sea. The 28 crew members on board were seasoned sailors who had spent their lives navigating the unique challenges of the Caspian, from sudden storms to the thick summer fogs. They shared stories and tobacco during their breaks, their voices low and steady as they discussed their families waiting for them at the journey's end. Every man had a specific role and a designated station, creating a complex social machine that functioned with a quiet and professional precision. Deep in the hold, the gold bars were packed into heavy wooden crates and secured with iron bands that were bolted directly into the floor of the cargo bay. This wealth was a burden of responsibility that every man on the ship felt, knowing that they were transporting the literal blood of the empire across dangerous waters. The oil tanks were also full, their dark contents shifting slightly with the motion of the ship, adding a tremendous weight that made the vessel ride low in the water. The ship's navigator sat at his small desk and marked their position on the charts with a steady hand, noting the time and the weather conditions in the official logbook. He was a precise man who found comfort in the mathematical certainty of the ship's path across the featureless expanse. His entries were neat and concise, providing a clear record of a voyage that appeared to be proceeding exactly according to the captain's plan, with no indication of any trouble on the horizon. On the forward deck, a young deckhand leaned against the rail and watched the stars as he whistled a soft tune that he had learned from his mother in a village far to the south. He enjoyed the quiet of the night watch, the way the wind felt against his face, and the sound of the water parting around the bow of the ship. It was a moment of peace in a life of hard labor, a brief interval where the world felt vast and full of possibilities that stretched beyond the iron hull. The ship's dog, a sturdy terrier who served as the unofficial mascot of the crew, curled up on a pile of rope near the engine room door and drifted into a light sleep. He was a creature of habit who knew the sounds of every man's footsteps and the timing of every shift change, providing a sense of normalcy to the industrial environment. The entire vessel was a closed system of life and work, operating with a confidence that only comes from years of successful voyages. At some point in the early hours of the morning, the deep and constant vibration of the engine began to stutter and slow, the rhythmic beat turning into a series of jagged mechanical gasps. The white steam that had been pouring from the funnel began to thin out, turning into a gray haze that drifted aimlessly over the deck as the ship lost its forward momentum. The silence that followed was heavy and unnatural, broken only by the sound of the waves licking the sides. 3 days later, the crew of a Russian naval patrol ship spotted the Caspian drifting aimlessly in the central waters, its sails furled and no smoke rising from its iron stacks. They signaled the vessel repeatedly with flags and lanterns, but no response came from the bridge or the decks, which appeared to be deserted. The patrol captain ordered a boarding party to investigate, his men rowing toward the silent ship with their rifles held ready across their laps. When the first officer of the patrol ship climbed over the rail, he was struck by the absolute stillness of the vessel, which swayed gently in the light swells without any sign of human activity. He walked along the deck toward the bridge, his boots echoing on the metal plates in a way that felt intrusive in the heavy silence. The lifeboats were all hanging from their davits, their covers still tied down with the original knots, indicating that no one had attempted to leave. In the dining hall, the boarding party found the table set for a meal that had never been finished, with pieces of bread and salt beef still sitting on the plates as if the men had just stepped away. The coffee pot on the stove was cold, but the liquid inside had not yet grown moldy, suggesting that the interruption had been sudden and relatively recent. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned chairs, and no blood on the floor to explain the absence of the men. The investigators moved down into the engine room, where they found the furnaces had burned themselves out, leaving only a pile of cold ash and the smell of stale coal dust. The gauges showed that the boilers had been functioning perfectly until the moment the fires died, and there was no evidence of a mechanical failure or an explosion. Everything was in its proper place, from the heavy shovels leaned against the wall to the grease rags sitting on the workbenches. The cargo hold remained exactly where it had been secured, the iron bands untouched and the seals on the crates still perfectly intact. This ruled out the possibility of a pirate attack, as no thief would have left behind a fortune in bullion while taking the time to remove every single person from the ship. The oil tanks were also full, showing no leaks or signs of tampering that could have led to a mass evacuation of the crew for urgent safety reasons. In the navigator's cabin, the logbook was open on the desk, the final entry recording their position and the weather at 2 o'clock in the morning with a steady and calm hand. The ink had dried long ago, and there were no frantic notes or smears that would indicate a crisis had occurred during the writing of the report. The charts were still pinned to the table, the brass dividers sitting exactly where the navigator had left them after his final measurement of the night. The boarding party began to notice a peculiar detail as they moved through the cabins and workspaces, checking the mechanical clocks that were mounted on the walls. Every single clock on the ship, from the ornate chronometer in the captain's quarters to the simple brass clock in the galley, had stopped at the exact same time. The hands were frozen at 15 minutes past 3, as if a single invisible hand had reached out and halted the passage of time across the vessel. You are standing in the center of the silent bridge, surrounded by the ghosts of 28 men, pee, and you realize that the ticking of your own heart is the only thing moving on this ship. The clocks on the wall are watching you with their frozen faces, and the empty air feels as though it is waiting for a sound that will never come. You look out over the rail at the endless water, and for a split second, the sea seems to have grown wider and much more hungry than before. I often think about what those men must have seen in that final minute when the clock stopped and the air went cold, and it makes me wonder how many other secrets are currently sitting at the bottom of that sea. It is a strange feeling to realize that we are all just one sudden shift in the earth away from becoming a mystery that no one can solve, no matter how many years of history pass us by. It places us on the same side of a very thin line between the known and the lost. The search of the ship reached a climax when the patrol party opened the door to the captain's private quarters and found the ship's terrier sitting perfectly still on the rug. The dog was alive and physically unharmed, but it did not bark or move as the men entered the room, its eyes fixed on a corner of the ceiling that appeared to be empty. The animal seemed to be in a state of profound shock, its body trembling slightly as if it were still feeling a vibration that the men could not. As the investigators looked closer at the dog, they noticed that its fur was covered in a fine layer of gray dust that felt strangely metallic and cold to the touch. This same dust was found on the surfaces of the bridge and the railing of the forward deck, appearing as a thin film that had settled over the vessel in a single moment. It was not soot or sea salt, but something that defied immediate identification by the naval doctors who later examined the samples in a lab. The mystery of the Caspian reached its breaking point when a second patrol ship found the captain's log from a different vessel that had been in the same area on that night. The other captain reported seeing a massive, silent flash of blue light that originated from the surface of the water and reached toward the clouds at exactly 3:15. He described the event as a pillar of gas, a sudden and violent release of methane from the seabed that could silence an entire crew. The most likely explanation for the disappearance is a phenomenon known as a limnic eruption, where a pocket of gas trapped under the sea floor is suddenly released by a minor tremor. This massive cloud of methane would have displaced all the oxygen on the ship in a matter of seconds, causing the crew to lose consciousness instantly and fall into the water. The gas would have also interfered with the mechanical operation of the clocks, causing them to stall as the air became thin. In this scenario, the men would have been standing at their posts one moment and gone the next, their bodies slipping over the side of the ship as the gas cloud expanded. The Caspian Sea is known to have massive deposits of natural gas beneath its bed, and similar events have been recorded in other parts of the world with equally devastating results. The silent nature of the gas meant that there was no sound of an explosion and no visible damage to the hull of the vessel. A detail that researchers found years later was that several of the crew members were known to be excellent swimmers who had survived shipwrecks in the past. This suggests that the gas did not just cause them to fall, but completely incapacitated their ability to react or even understand that they were in danger. The metallic dust found on the dog was later thought to be sediment from the deep seabed that had been carried upward by the force of the gas bubble as it broke. The Caspian was eventually towed back to port and its cargo was delivered, but no member of the original 28-man crew was ever seen or heard from again. The ship was sold to a different company and renamed, continuing to serve on the inland sea for another 2 decades before it was finally scrapped in a yard near Baku. The official naval report listed the cause of the disappearance as an act of God, a term used when the laws of men and science fail to provide an answer. As of the year 2026, advanced sonar mapping of the Caspian Sea floor has identified several large craters near the ship's last known position that match the signature of a gas eruption. These scars on the seabed remain as silent witnesses to the event that claimed the lives of 28 men in a single minute over a century ago. The files are kept in the state archives, where they serve as a warning to sailors about the invisible dangers that hide beneath the waves. The silent decks of a ghost ship are a haunting reminder of how quickly a life can be snuffed out by the environment, leaving nothing but stopped clocks behind. But while a cloud of gas is an impersonal force of nature, there are other dangers that are far more deliberate and much more intimate in their violence. We leave the open water of the Caspian and travel to the dry, stony hills of Sicily, where a different kind of shadow was waiting in the darkness of a locked wine cellar. In the late summer of 1903, in a sun-drenched village in Sicily, a wealthy landowner named Baron Ignazio stepped into his private wine cellar and turned the heavy iron bolt. The air down there was cool and smelled of damp earth and aging oak as he moved toward the racks of dusty bottles. He intended to select a vintage for his daughter's wedding feast, a small act of celebration that would be his last before the world went dark. The estate was a sprawl of golden hills and ancient stone walls that had survived for generations under the careful watch of the Ignazio family. Every morning, the Baron would stand on his balcony and survey the workers moving through the fields, their bent backs forming a rhythmic pattern against the horizon. He believed that the land belonged to him as much as his own skin, a conviction that was reflected in the way he walked with a steady and heavy stride. His wine was famous across the province for its deep color and the subtle hint of almond that came from the unique soil of his hillside. He kept a meticulous ledger of every barrel produced, recording the rainfall and the temperature with the obsession of a man who believed that quality could be controlled through sheer will. This book was bound in thick leather and sat on his desk as a testament to a life spent turning the dust of Sicily into liquid wealth. Ignazio was a man who took great pride in the geometric precision of his vineyards, often spending hours walking the rows to ensure the vines were tied with the exact same knot. He kept a small silver pocket knife on a chain, which he used only for pruning the most delicate grapes during the harvest season. This knife was a gift from his father, and it represented a lineage of labor and land that he guarded with a fierce and silent intensity every day. Every Sunday morning, the Baron would sit on the terrace with his sister and share a plate of sliced oranges drizzled with honey, a tradition that had remained unchanged for over 30 years. They would talk about the price of sulfur and the health of the local laborers, their voices blending with the distant sound of church bells echoing across the valley. It was a moment of connection that grounded him in the soil of his ancestors, far away from the world. Before the sun reached its peak each afternoon, Ignazio followed a specific path through the estate to check the water levels in the stone irrigation channels that fed his lemon trees. He would dip his hand into the cold stream, feeling the pulse of the water against his palm as a way of measuring the lifeblood of his property. This was a grounding ritual that he performed with a sense of quiet duty, unaware that the water would continue to flow long after he stopped. The first letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier, a single sheet of rough paper tucked into the frame of the front gate where the morning sun would hit it directly. There was no signature and no return address, only a crude drawing of a hand filled in with charcoal and a demand for 5,000 lire. Ignazio had burned the paper in the fireplace without saying a word to his family, believing that his status and his iron gates were enough to protect him from shadows. A second note appeared on the seat of his private carriage, resting exactly where he would sit to travel into the village for his weekly business meetings with the grain merchants. This time, the hand was accompanied by a single sentence, warning him that the price of silence was far higher than the gold they requested. He felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, noticing that his loyal dogs did not bark when the intruder approached the house. On the final evening, the Baron walked to the cellar with a heavy bunch of keys rattling against his thigh, their metallic sound echoing in the empty hallway. He felt the weight of the house above him, the centuries of history pressing down on his shoulders as he descended the stone steps into the darkness. He did not look back at the light of the hallway, focused only on the task of finding the perfect wine to toast to his daughter's future in the village. Giuseppe, the oldest servant in the household, watched the Baron descend the cellar stairs with a heavy tray of empty glasses and a sense of growing unease. He waited near the kitchen door for the sound of his master's voice calling for assistance, but the only noise that rose from the stone depths was the faint, rhythmic dripping of a leaky cask. The silence grew until it felt like a physical presence in the hallway, pressing against the ears of all waiting. As the minutes stretched into an hour, the kitchen staff began to whisper among themselves, their eyes darting to the closed cellar door with a mixture of curiosity and fear. They knew the Baron was a man of habit, and he never spent more than 20 minutes selecting a bottle before returning to his study. Giuseppe felt a bead of sweat roll down his temple as he gripped the edge of the wooden table, his instincts telling him that the silence was far too deep. Giuseppe finally approached the heavy oak door and found it was still bolted from the inside, the iron handle cold and unyielding under his trembling hand. He knocked softly at first, then with increasing force, his heart hammering against his ribs. as he realized there was no answer from the other side of the thick wood. He called out the Baron's name, but his voice seemed to be swallowed by the heavy air of the corridor, leaving him alone with his dread. He shouted for the other laborers to bring a heavy sledgehammer from the tool shed, their faces pale in the dim light of the hallway as they realized the severity of the situation. They gathered around the door, the heavy iron tool leaning against the stone wall like a weapon of war waiting to be used. Giuseppe gave the order to strike, and the sound of metal hitting wood rang out through the house, shattering the fragile peace of the evening for everyone. The door gave way with a splintering crash on the fourth strike, revealing a room that was perfectly cool and bathed in the soft glow of a single lantern left burning on a table. Giuseppe stepped over the debris and found the Baron lying on his back in the center of the room, his eyes open and staring at the vaulted ceiling. There were no signs of a struggle, and the expensive wine bottles remained undisturbed in their racks, yet the life had been gone from him. The local carabinieri arrived within the hour, led by a sergeant who had grown up in the same hills and knew the reputation of the estate as a place of absolute safety. He carefully examined the stone walls and the small, barred windows that were too narrow for even a child to pass through, finding no evidence of forced entry. The lock on the door was inspected and found to be in perfect working order, meaning the killer had somehow entered and exited without a key. It was not until the sergeant pulled back the Baron's fine linen shirt that the true nature of the crime became visible to the men standing in the damp air. Carved into the skin of his chest with surgical precision was the image of a black hand, the ink still fresh and the edges of the wound raw and angry. This was the mark of the Mano Nera, a secret organization that had begun to spread like a virus through the rural towns of Sicily, demanding tribute through fear. You are standing in that dark cellar, the smell of spilled wine and old stone filling your nose, and you realize that the bolt you slid into place to keep the world out was the very thing that trapped you with the shadow. You look at the marks on your own chest, feeling the phantom pain of a knife you never saw coming, and you understand that the silence outside the door is not protection. It is the sound of an entire village deciding that your life is worth less than their safety. The investigation quickly stalled as the sergeant realized that every witness he questioned in the village had suddenly lost the ability to remember anything unusual from that day. Men who had known the Baron for their entire lives turned their backs when the police approached, their eyes fixed on the ground in a desperate attempt to remain invisible. The code of silence, known as omerta, had descended over the valley like a heavy shroud, protecting the killers from the law. A reconstruction of the crime suggested that the killer had been hiding in the cellar for hours, perhaps even days, waiting for the perfect moment when the Baron would be alone. They had used a specialized wire to pull the bolt shut from the outside through a tiny gap in the masonry, creating the illusion of a locked room to delay the discovery. The mark on the chest was not just a signature, but a message to the rest of the landowning class that no wall was high enough. The sergeant found a single black thread caught on a jagged piece of stone near the ventilation shaft, a material that was much finer than the wool worn by the local peasants. He bagged the evidence with a sense of grim satisfaction, knowing that it pointed to a killer who was well-dressed and accustomed to moving in the highest circles of society. This detail suggested that the Mano Nera was not just a gang of thugs, but a coordinated network with deep roots in the city. Inside the Baron's desk, the police discovered a hidden drawer containing dozens of letters from other landowners who had been paying the secret society for years to avoid a similar fate. They spoke of midnight meetings and bags of gold left in the hollow of an old olive tree, revealing a secret economy of fear that existed right alongside the legitimate trade of the region. Ignazio had been the only one brave enough to refuse, and his body was the receipt for his defiance. Detectives later discovered that the Mano Nera had been tracking the Baron's daily movements for months, noting every time he touched the water or pruned a vine in his fields. They knew his schedule better than his own family did, using his predictable nature as the primary weapon against him during the assassination. This psychological profiling allowed them to strike with a level of confidence that made the entire community believe they possessed supernatural powers. No one was ever arrested for the murder of Baron Ignazio, and the estate was eventually sold off in small pieces to pay the mounting debts that followed his sudden and violent death. The wine cellar was filled in with concrete by the new owners, who wanted to erase the memory of the Black Hand from the soil of their new home. The Baron's name was slowly forgotten by all but the few who still whisper about the night the iron bolt failed to keep the shadows out. In the year 2026, the village in Sicily is a popular destination for tourists who walk the ancient vineyards without knowing the blood that was once spilled beneath them. The Manonera evolved into the modern structures of organized crime that still influence the economy of the region, though their methods have become far more sophisticated than a charcoal drawing. The case file remains a dark piece of history, proving that silence is often the most effective weapon ever made. I find myself thinking about that silver pruning knife and how quickly a symbol of life can become a relic of a world that was already ending, leaving us to wonder if the things we love most are simply the handles our enemies use to pull us into the dark, a cold realization that even the most fortified of lives can be dismantled by a single hand, reaching out from the silence of a society that has decided it is finally time for you to pay for your peace. The heavy silence of the Sicilian hills carries the weight of secrets that are never intended to be found, much like a person who vanishes in the middle of a scientific breakthrough. We leave the sun-scorched earth of the Mediterranean and travel north to the refined streets of Vienna, where a man of science was about to learn that some frequencies can pull a person right out of this reality. In 1906, a lab assistant was about to witness a flash of blue light. In the late autumn of 1906, a young laboratory assistant named Johann pushed open the heavy oak doors of a private estate in suburban Vienna and was greeted by a sharp scent of ozone. The air inside the stone laboratory was unusually warm, vibrating with a low and rhythmic hum that seemed to rattle the very bones in his chest as he stepped into the foyer. He could see the faint glow of gaslight reflecting off the brass surfaces of the Baron's complex machinery. Baron von Helldorf was a man who had long since turned his back on the social expectations of the Austrian aristocracy to pursue the invisible forces of the natural world. He spent his family fortune on massive copper coils and rows of glass vacuum tubes that filled his basement with a restless and flickering energy. He believed that electricity was not just a tool for lighting streets, but a key that could unlock the hidden dimensions of space and time that humans could not see. The Baron was known to spend 48 hours at a time hunched over his workbench, his fingers stained with silver nitrate and his eyes bloodshot from staring at the sparks of his generators. He kept a meticulous journal of every frequency he tested, filling thousands of pages with complex equations and sketches of geometric patterns that resembled ancient symbols. He spoke of a resonant frequency that could vibrate the physical world into a state of transparency for the observer. Despite his eccentricities, the Baron maintained a very strict and predictable routine that Johann had come to rely on for the safe management of the dangerous equipment in the room. Every morning, at precisely 7 o'clock, the Baron would emerge from his laboratory to eat a single piece of dry toast and drink a cup of black coffee. This was the only time he allowed any sunlight to touch his face, before retreating back into the artificial glow of his high-voltage experiments. One afternoon, Johann watched as the Baron carefully adjusted a set of massive glass lenses that were positioned in the center of a magnetic field produced by 4 copper towers. The Baron's hands were steady, his movements deliberate and calm as he fine-tuned the alignment of the apparatus to a fraction of a millimeter. He mentioned that the alignment of the stars that evening would provide the perfect conditions for a final test of his theory regarding the permeability of matter. The Baron paused for a moment to check the tension on the drive belts of the steam-powered generator that sat in the corner of the room, his face illuminated by the dancing blue sparks. He looked at Johann and told him that the results of tonight's experiment would change the way humanity perceived the concept of distance and physical barriers. It was a statement made with the quiet confidence of a man who had already seen the finish line of a very long and difficult race. As the sun began to set over the city, the Baron instructed Johann to wait in the upstairs hallway and to not enter the laboratory until the sound of the generator had completely stopped. He handed Johann a heavy silver watch and told him to mark the exact second the vibration ceased, regardless of what other noises might come from beneath the floorboards. Then, he stepped back into the laboratory and turned the iron bolt on the inside of the door, sealing himself within the room. The hum of the machinery grew louder over the next 3 hours, evolving from a low drone into a high-pitched whine that caused the glassware in the upstairs kitchen to shatter. Johann sat on a wooden bench in the hallway, his eyes fixed on the silver watch as he felt the floorboards beneath his feet begin to tremble with an increasing intensity. The air became thick with the smell of scorched copper and something else that reminded him of a thunderstorm about to break. At exactly 10 minutes past 10, a sudden and blinding flash of blue light erupted from the gaps beneath the laboratory door, casting long and distorted shadows against the hallway walls. The light was so intense that Johann had to shield his eyes, yet it was accompanied by a silence so profound that it felt like the entire world had been plunged into a vacuum. The vibration of the generator died instantly, leaving behind a stillness that was heavy and suffocating to the lungs. You are standing in that dark hallway, the afterimage of the blue light still burned into your retinas, and you realize that the silence is far more terrifying than the screaming machinery. You reach for the iron handle of the door, knowing that it is bolted from the inside, but the metal feels strangely soft and warm to your touch, like it is made of flesh rather than steel. You press your ear to the wood and hear nothing but a faint and distant sound that resembles wind over water. Johann called out for the Baron, but received no answer from the other side of the door, only the settling of the stone walls and the occasional clink of cooling metal. He waited for several minutes, his heart hammering against his ribs, before he gathered the courage to throw his shoulder against the heavy oak panels. The door did not budge, its bolt still firmly seated in the iron housing, forcing him to run to the garden shed to retrieve a heavy axe to break his way inside. The first blow of the axe revealed a room that was filled with a swirling and luminescent blue smoke that hung in the air like a thick fog, obscuring the floor and the workbenches. As Johann cleared the debris and stepped inside, he found that the massive copper coils had been melted into distorted lumps of slag that were still glowing with a dull red heat. The glass vacuum tubes had all shattered into a fine dust that covered every surface like a layer of fresh and sparkling snow. The Baron's tea service was still sitting on a side table near the center of the room, the saucer perfectly dry and free from any dust or chemical residue produced by the intense electrical event. This small circle of normalcy stood out against the destruction of the rest of the laboratory, appearing as if it had been protected by an invisible shield. Johann noted that the cup was still half full of cold coffee, with a single silver spoon resting exactly where the Baron had left it. Johann moved toward the center of the room, expecting to find the Baron's body lying among the wreckage of the expensive machinery he had spent his life building. Instead, he found only the Baron's leather boots sitting on the floorboards, perfectly upright and positioned as if someone were still standing in them. There were no clothes, no remains, and no signs of a struggle or a fire that could have consumed a human being in such a short and violent span of time. The police arrived shortly after midnight and conducted an exhaustive search of the basement, looking for any tunnels or hidden exits that the Baron could have used to stage a disappearance. They found that the stone walls were over 3 feet thick and completely unbroken, with no secret panels or mechanical passageways leading to the outside world. The windows were small, barred with iron, and still locked from the inside, making a physical escape an impossibility. An inspector from the Vienna Police Department noted that the Baron's personal journal was missing from its usual spot on the workbench, although all his other notes and sketches remained. It appeared as if the Baron had taken his most important findings with him, wherever he had gone, leaving behind only the evidence of his destruction. The inspector questioned Johann for several days, but the young man's story about the blue light and the silence never changed or faltered. A reconstruction of the experiment suggested that the Baron had succeeded in creating a massive electromagnetic pulse that had effectively vaporized the metallic components of his machinery. However, the energy required to vaporize a human body would have also leveled the entire house and left behind a significant amount of biological residue on the walls and ceiling. The fact that the room was intact and the tea set was clean contradicted every known law of physics. The investigation uncovered a letter that the Baron had written to a colleague in London just 2 days before the event, in which he spoke of his fear of what he had discovered. He wrote that the frequencies he was targeting were not a doorway to a place, but a way to fold the person into the space they already occupied. He mentioned that he felt as though he were being watched by something that existed in the gaps between the vibrations of the electrical hum. Detectives found a series of photographs that the Baron had taken during his preliminary tests, showing the laboratory appearing to melt and distort as the generators reached their peak power. In the final photograph, which was found still sitting in the camera, there was a faint and blurred outline of a figure standing in the center of the blue light. The figure appeared to be reaching out toward the lens, but the features were too distorted to be positively identified as the Baron. The official police report concluded that the Baron had likely been killed in a laboratory accident and his remains were somehow lost in the subsequent electrical fire. This explanation was widely accepted by the public, but it did not account for the locked door, the upright boots, or the complete absence of any biological evidence within the room. The estate was eventually sold to a distant relative who refused to enter the basement, eventually boarding up the stairs. In the year 2026, the Baron's notebooks that were left behind are kept in a restricted archive in Vienna, where they continue to baffle modern researchers in the field of physics. His theories on resonant frequencies and the folding of space are often cited as being decades ahead of their time, though no one has been able to replicate his final experiment. The laboratory remains sealed, a quiet monument to a man who may have found exactly what he was looking for. I often think about the Baron's boots sitting there in the middle of that room, and it makes me wonder if he is still standing there in the silence, just on a frequency we can no longer hear. It is a haunting image that suggests the barriers we believe are solid might be as thin as the steam rising from a cup of coffee. We are all just a few vibrations away from a blue light that could take us to a place where time no longer has any meaning for the observer. The disappearance of the Baron into a cloud of blue smoke leaves us with a lingering question about the limits of science and the cost of human curiosity in the dark. But while some vanish into the unknown through genius, others are pulled into the shadows by the simple and ancient power of greed. We leave the refined streets of Vienna and travel south to the dusty mining camps of Johannesburg, where a man with a charming smile was about to sell a miracle. In the heat of a January afternoon in 1905, Peter walked through the dusty streets of Johannesburg toward a meeting that promised to change his life forever. The air was thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of the nearby gold mines that had built the city from nothing. He adjusted his collar and felt the grit of the red South African earth against his skin, a constant reminder of the hard labor that had earned him his modest savings. Peter was a man who found great comfort in the predictable nature of his weekly chess matches at the local social club near the central station. Every Tuesday night, he would sit across from a retired postal clerk and move his wooden pieces with a deliberate slowness that mirrored his approach to his engineering career. He enjoyed the logic of the game, the way that every move had a clear consequence, and every mistake could be traced back to a specific moment of poor judgment. He had spent his childhood in a small coastal village where the only industry was the steady and predictable harvest of the sea. He had watched his father struggle against the tides for decades, earning just enough to keep the family fed and the roof repaired during the winter storms. This early exposure to the fragility of a labor-based life had instilled in him a desperate need for a security that could not be washed away by a single bad season on the open water. Earlier that morning, Peter had sat on the small veranda of his modest brick house and watched his wife tend to the wilted geraniums that struggled to survive in the harsh Transvaal sun. They had spoken quietly about their dreams of moving back to the coast, where the air was saltier and the pace of life was less frantic than the boomtown energy of the gold fields. He had squeezed her hand and promised that their days of saving every penny were nearly at an end. Before leaving for the city center, he had meticulously cleaned his heavy leather work boots with a stiff brush, removing the industrial grime of the mine shafts where he spent his days. It was a rhythmic and meditative task that he performed every single day, a small act of maintenance that reflected his pride in his profession and his status as a self-made man. He placed the brush back on its shelf, unaware that this was the last time he would ever perform this simple chore. The rumors had been circulating through the gentlemen's clubs for weeks, speaking of a Dutch aristocrat who had arrived with a technological marvel that could disrupt the entire global economy. This man, who called himself Baron von Hammer, claimed to have developed a steam-powered apparatus that used immense pressure to reorganize the carbon structure of common coal into high-quality diamonds. To a mining engineer like Peter, the science sounded revolutionary yet plausible. Peter entered the grand ballroom of the hotel and saw a massive iron machine sitting in the center of the floor, its copper valves hissing as it reached its operating temperature. The Baron stood beside it, wearing a tailored suit and a confident smile that seemed to radiate a sense of old-world authority and scientific certainty. He spoke with a rhythmic cadence that drew the crowd closer, promising that the age of digging in the dirt for wealth was over for everyone. The hotel lobby was a sea of velvet and mahogany, filled with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp perfume of women who had come to see the miracle for themselves. It was a world of absolute confidence, where the air seemed to hum with the possibility of effortless wealth and the end of the grimy reality of the working class. Peter felt out of place in his best suit, which still carried the faint scent of the machine shops despite his best efforts to clean the wool. The machine was a complex network of pistons and pressure gauges that thud-med with a deep and heavy pulse, vibrating the very floorboards beneath Peter's feet. He watched as the Baron took a handful of ordinary coal from a bucket and placed it into a small lead chamber at the top of the apparatus. There was a sudden increase in the sound of the steam, followed by a series of sharp mechanical clanks that signaled the beginning of the supposed chemical transformation. After 10 minutes of intense noise and heat, the Baron opened a small drawer at the base of the machine and pulled out 3 raw diamonds that sparkled in the overhead gaslight. He passed the stones around the room, allowing men like Peter to examine them with their own professional jeweler's loupes to verify their clarity and hardness. They were real, cold to the touch, and perfectly formed, appearing as if they had just been pulled from the deepest levels of a mine. Peter felt a surge of excitement that clouded his usual cautious nature as he calculated the potential returns on an investment in the Baron's new manufacturing company. He reached into his pocket and touched the envelope that contained his entire life savings, money intended for his retirement and his wife's future security. The Baron looked directly at him and nodded, as if he could sense the internal struggle and the desperate hope that was driving the man forward. You are standing in that crowded room, the heat from the steam machine warming your face, and you realize that this is the moment where your life either stays the same or changes forever. You look at the sparkling stones in the Baron's palm, and you see the house by the coast, the rest for your wife, and the end of the dark mine shafts. You hand over the envelope, feeling the weight of the paper leave your hand, and you believe that you have at last outsmarted the world. The following morning, Peter arrived at the designated factory site on the outskirts of the city, expecting to see the beginnings of a grand industrial operation that would change history. Instead, he found only a vacant lot filled with rusted scrap metal and a small, abandoned office that had been stripped of its furniture overnight. The iron gates were padlocked, and a single wind-blown sheet of paper was stuck to the fence, bearing no information about the company. He sat on a park bench across from the vacant lot and watched as a group of men in tattered clothes began to pick through the scrap metal left behind by the Baron's sudden departure. One of the men found a discarded valve from the machine and tossed it aside with a laugh, unaware that the small piece of brass represented the evaporated futures of dozens of families. Peter stayed there for hours, his hands gripping the cold metal as the reality of his loss began to settle. He rushed back to the hotel where the demonstration had taken place, only to find a frantic crowd of other investors gathered in the lobby, all of them holding useless stock certificates. The hotel manager informed them that the Baron had checked out in the middle of the night, leaving behind a massive unpaid bill and a heavy wooden crate that was too large to move in a hurry. The police were called, and they forced the crate open, revealing the secret behind the miracle. The investigators found that the steam machine was actually an elaborate hollow shell, containing a hidden compartment where a small child could have been concealed during the demonstration. This assistant would have simply swapped the coal for real diamonds that the Baron had purchased with the deposits from his earlier victims in other cities. The hissing steam and the rhythmic thumping were nothing more than a theatrical distraction designed to hide the manual labor. It is a hard thing to admit that we are all susceptible to the same kind of hope that makes a man blind to a mechanical lie when the promise of a better life is sitting right in front of him. I think most of us would like to believe we would see through the smoke and the noise, but you and I both know that a confident smile and a bit of brass can bypass the strongest logic. We are all searching for that one shortcut that eventually leads us out of the tunnels. When the police eventually searched the boarding house where the Baron had stayed, they found a collection of discarded wigs and false mustaches that had been used to change his appearance between different cities. There were also dozens of letters from women in various ports of call, each one written with a desperate affection that suggested he had used his charm to exploit more than just bank accounts. He left behind a trail of broken hearts and empty leather purses. The police tracked the name Baron von Hammer to a series of previous aliases, at last identifying the man as a career criminal named Henri Lemoine. He had operated similar schemes across Europe and North America, always staying one step ahead of the law by using the very money he stole to fund his escapes. He was a master of psychological manipulation, knowing exactly how to target the specific fears and desires of the middle-class men who were his primary targets. The diamonds used in the Johannesburg demonstration were actually legitimate stones that Lemoine had smuggled into the country from the De Beers mines where he had briefly worked as a clerk. He had spent months studying the technical jargon of the mining industry to ensure that his performance would stand up to the scrutiny of experts like Pieter. The machine itself was a masterpiece of stagecraft, built by a disgraced clockmaker who had been promised a share of the loot. A detail that emerged during the later trial was that Henri Lemoine did not just steal the money for the sake of wealth, but for the thrill of the deception itself. He kept a private ledger where he recorded the specific expressions on his victims' faces at the moment they handed over their savings, grading each interaction based on the level of trust he had established. He viewed his work not as a series of crimes, but as a form of high art where the medium was the heart. Pieter was never able to recover his savings, and the financial loss forced him to work in the deep gold mines of the Rand for another 15 years until his health at last failed him. He never spoke to his wife about the details of the demonstration, carrying the shame of his decision as a silent burden that aged him faster than the labor. The stock certificates remained in a drawer in his house, a worthless collection of paper that documented the exact price of his vanity. Pieter's wife eventually found out about the investment when the bank sent a notice regarding the depletion of their joint account during the winter of 1906. She did not scream or cry, but instead began to quietly pack away the fancy dishes they had bought for their future home by the sea, placing them in a wooden crate in the cellar. They never spoke of the Dutch Baron again, but the silence between them at the dinner table became a permanent fixture. By the year 2026, the case of the diamond machine is taught in forensic accounting courses as a classic example of a high-tech confidence game that exploited the excitement of a new era. Henri Lemoine eventually died in a French prison in 1920, but the principles of his fraud have been adapted by modern criminals who use the internet to sell the same old dreams. The empty ballroom of the hotel is now a quiet office space where no one hears the steam. The hollow thud of a fake machine is a sound that lingers long after the money is gone, reminding us that the most dangerous predators do not always arrive in the dark. Sometimes they stand in the middle of a crowded room and wait for us to walk right toward them with our hands open and our hearts full of hope. We leave the false promises of the city and head into the humid shadows of Mexico, where a different kind of man was walking by the river in 1908. Francisco Guerrero walked along the dusty banks of the Consuelo River in the early spring of 1908, his boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch on the dry silt. He wore a clean white shirt and a waistcoat that fit his slender frame with the precision of a man who cared deeply about his public appearance. The sunlight caught the silver buckle of his belt, casting a small, moving reflection on the reeds as he searched for a quiet place to sit. He stopped at a small street vendor's stall near the market to purchase a single piece of candied fruit, paying with a copper coin he had kept polished in his pocket. He greeted the vendor with a polite nod and a soft comment about the weather, his voice sounding like a gentleman of leisure rather than a man who had spent years behind the cold stone walls of a prison cell. He took a slow, deliberate bite of the fruit, savoring the sweetness as he looked at the crowd. Guerrero often sat on a wooden bench near the plaza and watched the neighborhood women wash their laundry in the shallow parts of the river, their laughter carrying over the sound of the water. He was known to some of them as a quiet and respectful neighbor who occasionally helped carry a heavy basket or offered a polite greeting in the morning. No one in the district suspected that the man with the gentle smile was the same person who had terrorized the city years before. In his small room, he kept a collection of silk ribbons that he had found or salvaged, each one ironed flat and stored in a cedar box beneath his bed. He found a strange sense of peace in organizing them by color, running his fingers over the smooth material as a way to pass the quiet hours of the evening. This private ritual was a hidden part of his personality, a delicate habit that stood in sharp contrast to the predatory nature that lived beneath his carefully polished exterior. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, he would visit a local church to sit in the back pew and listen to the organist practice, his head bowed as if he were deep in prayer. He did not participate in the religious services, but he enjoyed the resonance of the music and the way the incense masked the smell of the city's drainage. It was a routine that allowed him to blend into the fabric of the community, appearing as a man seeking redemption rather than one waiting for a chance. On a Tuesday in April, he noticed an elderly woman walking alone toward the outskirts of the district, carrying a small bundle of firewood that she had gathered from the thickets. He stood up from his bench and began to follow her at a distance, his movements fluid and silent as he mirrored her pace through the shadows of the tall trees. He felt a familiar and cold clarity beginning to take hold of his mind, a sharpening of his senses that focused entirely on the target ahead. He quickened his step until he was walking directly behind her, his shadow stretching out across the path to touch the hem of her frayed skirt in the fading light. He reached out and offered to help her with the heavy load, his voice a low and soothing murmur that had disarmed many others in the past. She looked up at him with tired eyes and a grateful smile, handing him the bundle of wood without a single moment of hesitation or the slightest inkling of the danger she faced. They moved together toward a secluded area where the riverbank dipped into a steep and overgrown ravine, the sound of the city fading away behind the dense screen of vegetation. He led the way with the firewood balanced on his shoulder, his eyes scanning the perimeter to ensure they were completely alone in the growing twilight. The woman followed him into the darkness of the brush, her footsteps light and trusting as she moved further away from the safety of the open road. You are standing in the cooling shadows of the ravine, and you realize that the polite man who offered to help has stopped moving and is now staring at you with eyes that have gone completely flat. The sound of the river is the only thing you can hear, and the bundle of wood he was carrying has been dropped on the ground between you like a final barrier. You see his hand reach toward his belt, and the world suddenly feels very small and very cold as the light disappears. Guerrero performed his final actions with a mechanical and practiced efficiency, leaving the bundle of wood scattered across the damp earth as a silent witness to the encounter. He did not rush, taking the time to adjust his own clothing and wipe the dust from his boots before stepping back onto the main path leading toward the market. The air in the ravine was still, the water of the Consuelo continuing its steady flow toward the center of the city without any interruption. A group of local children playing near the river the following morning found a piece of colorful fabric caught on a thorn bush, leading them down into the hidden ravine. They ran back to the main street in a panic, their screams drawing the attention of a nearby police officer who had been patrolling the market area. He followed their pointing hands down into the brush, his hand resting on the hilt of his saber as he prepared for the sight that he knew would be waiting for him. Inspector Velasco arrived at the scene and immediately noted the similarities between this crime and the series of unsolved murders that had haunted the city during the late 1880s. He looked at the precise nature of the scene and felt a deep and familiar sense of dread as he realized that the monster they had supposedly locked away might be back on the streets. He ordered his men to cordon off the area, but the news of the Chalicero had already begun to spread. The police records from 1904 were pulled from the archives, revealing a catastrophic clerical error that had led to Guerrero's premature release from the federal prison. A pardon intended for a minor offender had been incorrectly applied to his file, allowing the most dangerous man in Mexico to simply walk out the front gate with a new suit and a small sum of money. The realization of this mistake sent a wave of fear through the capital's administrative offices. A fruit vendor from the market came forward to report a man matching Guerrero's description, who had been a regular customer and a quiet observer of the local women for several months. He described the man's polite demeanor and his habit of cleaning his boots with a small brush while sitting on the park benches near the river. This detail provided the detectives with the first solid link between the gentle neighbor and the brutal history of the man they were searching for. The investigation team began a secret canvass of the residential buildings near the river, looking for any record of a new tenant who spent his afternoons in the city's churches or parks. They found a small room registered under a false name, where the landlord described a tenant who was exceptionally clean and never caused any trouble or late-night noise. The detectives positioned themselves in a nearby shop, watching the entrance of the building for any sign of the silver belt buckle. During the search of the rented room, officers found a collection of ironed silk ribbons and a small tin of boot polish, but no evidence of the crimes that had recently taken place in the ravine. They noted that the bed was perfectly made, and the few items of clothing in the wardrobe were hung with a level of care that suggested a highly disciplined and organized mind. This evidence reinforced Velasco's belief that they were dealing with a man who could blend in anywhere he chose. Detectives tracked Guerrero's movements through the local pawn shops, discovering that he had recently sold a small silver religious medal that did not belong to him. They cross-referenced the item with a list of belongings from a different missing person case, realizing that the elderly woman in the ravine was not his only victim since his release. The scope of the investigation expanded as they realized they were now dealing with an active and mobile serial killer in the city. Velasco organized a massive surveillance operation throughout the markets and churches where the suspect had been seen, his men dressed in civilian clothing to avoid alerting their target. They watched the riverbanks and the narrow alleys of the Consuelo district, waiting for a single glimpse of the white shirt and the silver belt buckle. Every day that passed without an arrest increased the pressure on the department, as the public demanded to know how such a man was free. On a crowded Friday afternoon, an officer spotted a man sitting calmly on a bench in the main plaza, holding a piece of candied fruit and watching the sunset with a look of absolute peace. The officer signaled for backup, and within minutes, 6 plainclothes detectives had surrounded the bench, their hands hovering near their concealed weapons. Guerrero did not attempt to flee, merely looking up at the men with a slight and enigmatic smile as they identified him by name. During the subsequent interrogation, it was revealed that Guerrero had committed at least one other murder since his release, targeting a young girl whose body had been hidden in a different part of the city. He spoke about his crimes with a chilling lack of emotion, describing his victims as if they were objects he had simply encountered during his walks. He believed that his release from prison was a sign that he was permitted to resume his old life exactly as he wished. The truth about his methods was finally established through a series of witness testimonies from women who had narrowly escaped his attention in the weeks leading up to his final arrest. They described a man who was helpful and charming, often offering to carry heavy loads or providing directions with a level of courtesy that felt almost old-fashioned. His ability to manipulate the social norms of the era was his most effective tool, allowing him to lure his victims into the dark. The most disturbing detail discovered by the psychiatric experts was that Guerrero kept a list of his potential targets in his head, categorized by the specific way they had looked at him. He believed that a woman's gaze could provide him with a silent permission to act, interpreting a simple look of fatigue or kindness as a direct invitation into his world of violence. This internal logic allowed him to justify his actions while maintaining his public persona as a gentleman. Francisco Guerrero was sentenced to death for the second time, but he died of natural causes in his prison cell in late 1910 before the execution could be carried out. His death marked the end of the first documented case of a serial killer in Mexican history, leaving a legacy of fear that would persist for generations. Today, the judicial error that allowed his release is still cited in legal textbooks as a warning about the high cost of administrative failure. I find it difficult to reconcile the image of a man ironing silk ribbons with the cold reality of the actions he committed in the tall grass by the river. It is a reminder that the most dangerous people in our history are rarely the ones who look like monsters, but the ones who know exactly how to mirror the kindness and the discipline that we expect from a neighbor. This reflection on the nature of the mask is something I carry with me whenever I hear a polite stranger. The shadows of the Consuelo River eventually gave way to the cold stone of a prison cell, but the memory of a polite killer remains a stain on the history of the city. We move from the calculated hunt of a man to the collective and silent death of a group seeking something far beyond this world. We travel to the dense brush of Bengal, India, in 1901, where a British officer was about to find 12 people who had died with smiles on their faces. In the heavy heat of April 1901, Lieutenant Arthur Penhaligon led his unit through the dense and tangled brush of the Bengal interior. The air was a thick blanket of moisture that carried the smell of rotting vegetation and the sharp, metallic tang of the local river mud. He wiped the sweat from his eyes and pushed aside a massive palm leaf, his hand resting on the leather holster of his service revolver as he moved toward the village. The small village of Kaspur appeared as a cluster of low mud huts and thatched roofs nestled in a clearing where the trees seemed to lean in with a watchful and oppressive weight. For generations, The people here had maintained a quiet existence, centered around the seasonal harvests of rice and the rhythmic ceremonies that marked the passing of the moon. They lived in a world where the boundaries between the physical and the spiritual were as thin as the morning mist. One young man named Ravi had spent his mornings repairing the woven fish traps that he set in the slow-moving waters of the nearby creek, his fingers moving with a practiced and mechanical grace. He often sat with his younger sister under the shade of a banyan tree, sharing a bowl of spiced lentils while they watched the birds circle above the canopy. It was a life of simple actions and repetitive duties that anchored him to the soil and to the history of his family. Every evening at sunset, the community would gather in the central plaza to light small oil lamps that flickered against the encroaching darkness, their shadows dancing on the worn clay ground. They spoke in low tones about the rumors of a new teacher who had arrived from the deep jungle, a man who spoke of a path to eternal life that required no wealth or status. This message of escape was a powerful draw for those whose lives were defined by the crushing cycle of labor. Ravi had begun to spend more of his time at a hidden shrine located a mile from the village, where the air was perfumed with the scent of crushed marigolds and expensive sandalwood incense. He had stopped bringing home the fish he caught, instead offering them to a large stone basin that sat at the feet of a hooded figure carved from dark wood. His movements had become slower and more deliberate, his eyes reflecting a sense of inner peace that his family did not understand. Before his final departure, Ravi had carefully folded his only spare tunic and placed it on his sleeping mat, a small and final act of organization that suggested he did not intend to return to his old life. He looked at his sleeping sister one last time, his face illuminated by the dying embers of the cooking fire, and then stepped out into the night without a sound. He walked toward the sound of the flutes that were playing a melody only the devoted were meant to hear. The teacher, a man known as the Messenger of Naga, sat in the center of the clearing and spoke to his followers about the beauty of the venom that would soon set their spirits free. He handled a massive king cobra with a casual and terrifying intimacy. The snake's hood flared as it swayed to the rhythm of his breathing. The followers watched with a collective and silent adoration, their hearts beating in a synchronized rhythm that felt like the pulse of the jungle itself. The village elders contacted the British authorities after 12 of their young men and women failed to return from a midnight gathering at the jungle shrine, leaving their tools and chores unfinished. A silence had fallen over the community, a heavy and fearful void that replaced the usual sounds of children playing and the rhythmic pounding of grain. The local headman described a strange, shimmering light that had been seen rising above the trees in the early hours. Lieutenant Penhaligon reached the clearing and signaled for his men to stop, his breath catching in his throat as he looked upon the scene that lay before them in the dappled sunlight. 12 figures were seated in a perfect and unbroken circle on the grass, their bodies upright and their hands resting on their knees in a traditional meditative pose. They were dressed in white robes that remained remarkably clean despite the humidity and the surrounding decay. As the soldiers moved closer, they realized that the circle was not empty, but was instead filled with dozens of live cobras that moved through the tall grass with a soft and rustling sound. The snakes did not strike at the intruders, but appeared to be guarding the seated figures with a calm and predatory patience. The air was unnaturally still, the usual sounds of the jungle birds and insects having been replaced by the collective hiss of the serpents in the clearing. Penhaligon ordered his men to use long bamboo poles to clear the snakes from the perimeter, a task that required a high level of focus and a steady hand as the reptiles resisted being moved. Once the area was secure, he stepped into the circle and approached the figure of Ravi, noticing that the young man's skin was a pale and translucent gray. He reached out to check for a pulse, but he already knew that the life had departed from the body long before they arrived. The most disturbing aspect of the scene was the expression on each of the 12 faces, which were all fixed in a wide and uncanny smile that revealed their teeth. This look was not one of pain or terror, but of a profound and ecstatic joy that seemed to defy the reality of their physical condition. It looked as though they had all witnessed something beautiful at the exact moment their hearts stopped beating, a final vision that remained etched into their cold features. The investigators found that the hem of each white robe was embroidered with a single thread of gold that formed the shape of a serpent eating its own tail, a detail that was consistent across all 12 victims. This level of craftsmanship suggested a high degree of organization and financial investment by the cult leader, who had apparently spared no expense to mark his followers with this specific symbol. It was a quiet and expensive signature that stood out against the mud. The medical examiner from the garrison arrived later that afternoon and conducted a preliminary inspection of the bodies, looking for the telltale marks of a struggle or a violent struggle. He found that every single person had multiple puncture wounds on their arms and legs, consistent with repeated bites from a venomous snake. However, there was no swelling and no discoloration of the skin, which was a medical impossibility given the known effects of cobra venom. A thorough search of the clearing revealed a small clay bowl sitting in front of each person, containing the remains of a dark and pungent liquid that smelled of fermented honey and crushed herbs. The examiner hypothesized that this mixture was a potent neurotoxin that had acted as a local anesthetic, preventing the body from reacting normally to the introduction of the venom. It was a sophisticated chemical cocktail that had been designed to create a painless exit. The focus of the investigation shifted to the center of the circle, where a large stone had been carved into the likeness of a coiled snake with its mouth open toward the sky. On top of the stone sat a single, discarded flute made of human bone, which still carried the faint scent of the teacher's breath and the oils of his skin. This was the spot where the messenger of Naga had stood to conduct the ceremony, yet there was no sign of his body or any indication of where he had gone. You are standing in the center of that circle, the cold eyes of 12 smiling corpses fixed on you, and you realize that the man who led them here is the only one who didn't follow them into the dark. The sound of the wind through the trees starts to sound like a low and mocking hiss, and you feel a sudden, sharp pressure against your ankle, as if something is moving through the grass at your feet. The white robes around you begin to flutter like the wings of a trapped bird in the rising heat. Penhaligon realized that the tracks leading away from the shrine did not belong to a man, but were instead a single, wide drag mark that moved deeper into the thickest part of the swamp. It was as if a massive and heavy weight had been pulled through the mud, with a level of strength that was beyond any human capacity. He led his men on a pursuit for several miles, but the trail eventually vanished into the standing water of a mangrove thicket where the horses could not pass. The pursuit was abandoned as the sun began to set, the men returning to the clearing to begin the grim process of transporting the 12 bodies back to the village for burial. They moved with a frantic energy, desperate to leave the area before the darkness returned and the snakes reclaimed their territory. The smiles of the dead seemed to grow wider in the fading light, a silent and permanent judgment on the living who had arrived too late to stop the transition. The investigation eventually concluded that the messenger of Naga was likely a former medical student who had used his knowledge of pharmacology to manipulate the villagers into a suicide pact. He had convinced them that the snakes were divine vehicles that would carry their consciousness into a higher state of existence, provided they were sufficiently prepared by the herbal drink. He had acted as a predator, harvesting the lives of the young and the hopeful for a purpose that was never revealed. The central human factor in this tragedy was the absolute and unwavering trust that the victims placed in a man who offered them an escape from the harsh realities of their colonial existence. This desire for transcendence was so powerful that it overrode the most basic instincts of self-preservation and the fear of a painful death. They did not see the snakes as a threat, but as a promise, a perspective that allowed them to walk into the clearing with their heads held high. A key piece of evidence that was discovered months later was a hidden cache of gold and silver jewelry found in a hollow tree near the shrine, all of which had belonged to the victims. The teacher had not just taken their lives, but had also systematically stripped them of their material wealth before leading them to their deaths. This revealed the true nature of the messenger as a common thief who used the mask of a spiritual leader to facilitate a calculated robbery. The identity of the messenger was never officially established, and no one matching his description was ever captured by the British authorities in the years following the event. He vanished into the vast and untracked wilderness of the Bengal interior, leaving behind only the memory of the smiles and the empty clay bowls in the clearing. The village of Kaspur eventually moved to a different location, the people refusing to live near a site that they believed was cursed. In the year 2026, the site of the jungle shrine is a mound of overgrown stone and tangled vines that is avoided by the local guides who take researchers into the interior. The case remains a disturbing entry in the historical records of the British Raj, serving as a study in the intersection of religious fervor and criminal manipulation. Modern toxicologists have analyzed the remaining traces of the liquid, confirming that it was a highly complex and effective compound. The image of 12 smiling faces in a jungle clearing is a cold reminder that the most dangerous traps are often built from our own deepest desires for something better than the world we know. We are left to wonder if those final moments were truly beautiful for them, or if the smiles were just the last trick of a man who knew exactly how to make a tragedy look like a miracle. The snakes have long since moved on, but the silence in that part of the jungle still carries a very heavy weight. The humid air of the Bengal jungle carries the scent of flowers and the heavy silence of those who sought a different reality through a circle of serpents. This same sense of a mysterious and impossible death was waiting in a much colder climate far to the north in the heart of the German Black Forest just a year later. In 1902, a group of woodcutters would walk into a ring of oak trees and find a man who had been emptied of his life without a single drop of blood. In the early spring of 1902, deep within the humid shadows of the German Black Forest, a young man named Hans stepped off the main carriage road and began his walk through the dense thickets of the Schwarzwald. The moss beneath his boots was thick and damp, absorbing the sound of his footsteps as he moved away from the gravel paths. The towering pines blocked out most of the morning sun, creating a world of perpetual gray and green. Hans carried a small wooden case containing his drafting tools, which he kept polished and arranged by size with a level of care that bordered on the obsessive. He had spent the last 3 years in the city of Stuttgart, studying the geometry of cathedral architecture and the mathematics of structural balance. He found a deep satisfaction in the way a single line on a blueprint could dictate the strength of a massive stone wall and the light of a room for centuries. He had written a letter to his mother the night before his departure, describing the specific patterns of the local wildflowers he had seen in the city parks and promising to bring her a bag of specialty coffee. They shared a mutual love for the quiet hours of the morning when the house was still cool and the smell of the brew filled the kitchen. It was a simple connection that had remained unchanged since he was a small child living in their village near Triberg. Every afternoon at 4 o'clock, Hans would stop wherever he was to sharpen his pencils, using a small silver knife with a handle made of polished bone. He performed this task with a focused intensity, ensuring that every point was identical in length and sharpness before he would resume his work on the sketches. This ritual provided a sense of order and control in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable to a young man trying to find his own way forward. He checked the silver watch that hung from a chain on his waistcoat, noting the time and adjusting his pace to ensure he reached the next village before the shadows grew too long. He enjoyed the physical sensation of the air moving against his face and the rhythmic swing of his arms as he walked through the cooling woods. It was a moment of absolute freedom and health, a celebration of the strength of his legs and the clarity of his own lungs in the mountain air. Hans paused briefly near a small stream to splash cold water on his face, feeling the sharp sting of the mountain runoff against his skin as a way to refresh his tired mind. He watched a single leaf tumble over the rocks, following its jagged path through the swirling current until it disappeared into the dark pools beneath the ferns. He did not know that this would be the final time he would ever feel the cold bite of the water or see the light on the surface. He stood up and straightened his jacket, brushing a few pine needles from his trousers with a quick and efficient movement of his hand before continuing his trek. He noticed that the birds had gone quiet in this section of the woods, the only sound being the distant groan of the trees as they swayed in a wind that did not reach the forest floor. He adjusted the strap of his wooden case and took a deep breath of the pine-scented air, moving toward a clearing. As he reached the center of a perfect ring of ancient oak trees, the forest floor seemed to tilt as the air temperature dropped enough to form frost on his brass buckles. The atmosphere around him thickened and slowed, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made the silver watch in his pocket begin to tick with a frantic and uneven rhythm. Hans stopped in his tracks, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the circle for a movement he could not name or understand. 2 days later, a group of woodcutters entered the same circle of oaks and found the young man lying on the forest floor, his body positioned with a geometric precision. He was on his back, with his arms spread wide and his eyes open, staring at the canopy above with an expression of profound and silent surprise. There were no signs of a struggle in the soft mud around him, and the moss was undisturbed as if he had been placed there from above by a giant hand. The lead woodcutter noticed that the young man's clothes were not on his body, but were instead neatly folded and stacked on a large, flat stone at the edge of the ring. The drafting tools were laid out in a perfect row beside his boots, yet the boots themselves were completely empty, and the man's feet were bare. He crossed himself and refused to touch the body, sensing that the silence of the clearing was far more dangerous than any predator he had encountered. The local gendarmerie arrived and immediately noted the strange condition of the scene, which felt more like a staged museum display than a place of natural death. The investigator found it impossible to believe that a man would undress himself in the freezing cold and arrange his belongings with such care before lying down to die. He checked the ground for footprints, but the only tracks visible belonged to the victim, and they ended abruptly at the center. The medical examiner noted that while the body was pale and translucent, there was not a single scratch, bruise, or wound on the skin to indicate how the man had died. When he performed the initial incision for the autopsy, he was stunned to find that the entire circulatory system of the victim was completely empty of fluid. It was as if every drop of blood had been systematically removed from the body without leaving a single external mark or a drop on the grass. You and I have both looked at the dark corners of the woods on a quiet night and wondered if the trees themselves were keeping a tally of the things that go missing. It is a shared instinct to move a little faster when the birds stop singing and the shadows begin to stretch toward your feet. We find comfort in the logic of the road, but the forest operates on a timeline and a set of rules that do not care about our need for a clear and simple answer. The primary investigator discovered a small and highly unusual detail tucked into the victim's pocket after the clothes were transported to the station for evidence processing. It was a single, perfectly preserved oak leaf made entirely of solid silver, its veins and stem rendered with a level of biological accuracy that was beyond any jeweler. There was no record of the young man ever owning such an item, or of any shop in the entire region that sold such things. You are standing in the center of that ring of trees, and you realize that the silence is not coming from the woods, but from the fact that the air has stopped moving. You look down at your own hands and see the color begin to drain out of your skin, not from cold, but from a pull that feels like it is coming from the ground. The neat stack of your clothes on the rock feels like a distant memory from a life you no longer own or recognize as yours. The final autopsy report concluded that the victim's heart had simply stopped beating in a state of absolute and total contraction, a condition usually associated with shock. However, there were no burn marks on the body, and the weather on the night of the disappearance had been perfectly clear, with no recorded lightning in the area. The complete absence of blood remained a medical mystery that the local doctors could not explain with their 19th century tools. The most haunting detail of the case was the discovery that the victim's drafting case contained a final unfinished sketch that he had been working on inside the circle. It was not a building or a bridge, but a precise map of the very ring of oak trees where he was found, drawn from an aerial perspective as if he were looking down. The map showed 13 figures standing in the circle, but only 12 of them had been assigned a name or a human face. The identity of the young man was eventually confirmed as Hans Vogel, but the circumstances of his death were never resolved by the German authorities or the investigators. He was buried in a small cemetery on the edge of the forest, his drafting tools placed in the coffin alongside him as a way to provide some order to his final rest. The silver leaf was kept in a police evidence locker for several years until it was lost during the chaos of the Great War. By the year 2026, the circle of oak trees in the Black Forest has become a site of interest for researchers who study anomalous magnetic fields and phenomena. Modern sensors have detected a recurring frequency that originates from the center of the ring, matching the vibration that Hans had noted in his final minutes. The case file of the bloodless man remains a cold and silent chapter in the archives, a story that the forest refuses to give up. The cold and silent geometry of a forest death leaves a hollow feeling in the stomach, a reminder that some patterns are not meant for human eyes to decode or understand. But while the Black Forest hides its secrets in the moss and the trees, the high society of Paris prefers to hide its darkness behind the elegant silk of a political scandal. We leave the mist of the German woods and head toward the stone mansions of France in 1908. In May of 1908, on the Rue de l'Impasse in a quiet corner of Paris, Detective Jules Bellin adjusted his heavy wool coat and stepped over the threshold of a sprawling stone mansion. The air inside the foyer was thick with the scent of stale lilies and expensive floor wax, a combination that usually signaled a house in mourning. He walked past the silent servants and felt the cold draft of the hallway against his face as he moved toward the scene of the crime. Marguerite Steinheil sat in her salon with her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of calculated grief as she watched the investigators move through her home. She was a woman of immense social power, known as the Red Widow because of her past relationship with a former president of France. She wore a black silk gown that shimmered under the gaslight, a garment that looked more like a uniform of war than a dress for a grieving daughter and wife who had just lost her entire world. Adolphe Steinheil, Marguerite's husband, had spent his final afternoon in his upstairs studio, meticulously cleaning the brushes he used for his portrait commissions. He was a man of quiet habits and fading talent, living in the shadow of his wife's political connections and the high stakes of Parisian society. He preferred the smell of linseed oil and turpentine to the heavy perfumes of the salons that Marguerite frequently hosted for the city's elite in the rooms below his quiet workspace. Madame Japy, Marguerite's mother, had visited the mansion that evening to discuss the family's travel plans for the upcoming summer season in the countryside. They had sat in the small dining room and shared a pot of lavender tea, the steam rising between them as they debated the merits of different coastal towns. It was a normal conversation between a mother and daughter, filled with the mundane details of a life that felt entirely safe and predictable to everyone in the grand stone house. The household staff had completed their evening rounds, extinguishing the gas lamps and checking the locks on the heavy iron doors that led to the private courtyard. The rhythmic sound of the heavy bolts sliding into place was a nightly comfort, a signal that the external world of Paris was finally shut out for the night. This was a house built for secrets and for the quiet preservation of a legacy that reached into the highest offices of the government and the hearts of many powerful men. Adolphe had placed his latest unfinished painting on the easel and covered it with a thin muslin sheet, a habit he maintained to keep the dust from settling on the wet oil. He took a final look at the colors in the fading light, his mind already moving toward the breakfast meeting he had scheduled for the following morning. He did not know that he would never see the sun rise over the Seine again, or that his brushes would never touch a canvas again in the silence of his private studio. The valet had laid out Marguerite's evening robe and placed a single glass of warm milk on her bedside table, a ritual meant to help her sleep after the long days of social engagement. He bowed as he left the room, his footsteps fading into the thick carpets of the hallway as he went to his own quarters in the attic. The house was a machine of service and class, operating with a silence that made the sudden violence of the night seem even more impossible to the detectives who arrived. At approximately midnight, Marguerite claimed that 4 strangers wearing long black robes and masks entered her bedroom and pinned her to the mattress with a sudden force. She described them as shadows that moved with a coordinated and silent purpose, their faces hidden behind fabric that smelled of damp earth and old coal. They did not speak or demand money, but instead began to tie her wrists and ankles with long strips of blue silk they had brought with them into the locked mansion. The valet discovered Marguerite the following morning after she failed to ring the bell for her breakfast, finding her bound and gagged in her bed with her eyes wide with terror. He rushed to the adjacent rooms and found Adolphe and Mamie Japy lying motionless, their bodies still warm but their breath long since gone from their lungs. The house was a tomb of silent silk and unmoving air, the morning sun casting long and jagged shadows across the crime scene as the police were finally called. Detective Bellin arrived at the mansion and immediately noticed that the heavy iron bolts on the exterior doors were still in their locked positions, showing no signs of being forced. He walked through the rooms with a magnifying glass, looking for the telltale signs of a struggle or the presence of the masked intruders Marguerite had described. He found only the smell of lavender tea and the faint, lingering scent of the expensive tobacco that Adolphe had smoked before going to bed. Bellin focused his attention on the blue silk strips used to bind the widow, noticing that the material was of an exceptionally high quality, usually reserved for the elite. He sat on the edge of the bed and examined the knots on Marguerite's wrists, his fingers tracing the loops with a rhythmic and observant touch. He was a man who understood the mechanics of rope and the physics of how a body moves when it is truly trying to escape from a physical restraint in a moment of absolute fear. The detective noted that the knots were loose enough that Marguerite could have easily slipped her hands free at any moment during the night she claimed to be trapped. This discrepancy was the first crack in the story of the home invasion, a small detail that did not align with the brutal and efficient murders of her husband and mother. He looked at her wrists and saw no bruising or skin irritation, which was unusual for someone who had been bound for hours by violent and angry men. Boleyn ordered a thorough search of the mansion's attic and the hidden compartments beneath the floorboards, looking for the black robes or the masks mentioned in the report. His men found nothing but old furniture and the dust of decades, a void of physical evidence that contradicted the existence of 4 intruders in such a confined space. He began to suspect that the intruders were a fiction created to mask a much more personal and internal motive for the crimes of the previous night. The autopsy of Adolphe and Mem Jappi revealed that they had both been killed with a single, heavy cord that left a specific and narrow indentation on their necks. This indicated a killer with a significant amount of upper body strength and a cold, methodical approach to the act of ending a life in the dark. Boleyn compared this to the delicate and loose silk knots on Marguerite's wrists, realizing that the contrast was a message intended to mislead the police and gain their sympathy. Investigation into Marguerite's financial history revealed that she was deeply in debt and was facing the public exposure of her many high-profile affairs within the city. She had been using her status and her secrets to blackmail several prominent politicians, creating a web of enemies who would have benefited from her silence or her complete disappearance. Boleyn felt the weight of the political pressure from his superiors, who were desperate to avoid a public scandal in the papers. The detective discovered a hidden cache of letters in the back of a writing desk, all of them written by Marguerite to a man who was not her husband and who had a history of violence. The letters spoke of a plan to free themselves from the burden of her marriage and the constant interference of her mother's demands for a respectable social image. This was the first piece of evidence that linked Marguerite to a specific accomplice and a clear motive for the actions of that dark night. Boleyn confronted Marguerite in her salon and placed the blue silk strips on the table between them, his voice calm and precise as he pointed out the flaws in her story. He revealed that the knots had been tied by someone who wanted her to survive, while the cord on the victims had been handled by a killer named Remy Couillard. Remy was a former soldier and a frequent visitor to the Steinheil mansion who had disappeared on the very night of the murders without a single trace left. Marguerite did not flinch or cry out as the name was spoken, her face remaining a mask of absolute and chilling composure as she reached for a glass of water. She looked at Boleyn with a steady and calculating gaze, reminding him of the many secrets she still held regarding the death of the former president in her private salon. The air in the room became heavy with the unspoken threat of a scandal that could topple the current government if she finally chose to speak to the press. You are sitting in that chair across from the detective, the blue silk strips sitting on the wood like a coiled snake, and you realize that the truth is a luxury you can no longer afford. You see the reflection of the gaslight in his eyes, and you know that he has seen the loose knots, the lack of bruises, and the hollow nature of your grief. You want to pull the cord tight around the room, but your own hands are the ones that have tied the lie that is now slowly choking your future. The Sûreté detectives eventually tracked Remy Couillard to a small hotel near the docks, but they found that he had already been silenced by a different set of hands before they arrived. This left Marguerite as the sole living participant in the conspiracy, a woman whose political influence was still strong enough to reach into the heart of the judicial system. The investigation was quietly redirected away from her and toward a mysterious and unknown band of robbers that never existed. The truth of the matter was that Marguerite had hired Remy to remove the 2 people who stood in the way of her inheritance and her freedom to pursue her high-stakes political games. She had tied her own knots and placed herself in the bed to appear as a victim, calculating that her status as the Red Widow would protect her from the scrutiny of a common murder probe. It was a gamble made with the lives of her own family and the reputation of the Paris police in the cold of the night. I sometimes look at the way people weave their own narratives to survive a tragedy, and it makes me think about how much of our history is just a series of well-tied knots meant to hold a lie in place. It is a lonely realization to understand that the people we think are victims are often the ones holding the other end of the rope in the dark. We all have a version of the truth that we tell ourselves to stay warm at night, even when the rest of the house is finally gone and cold. One detail that the police never released to the public was that Marguerite had rearranged the furniture in her mother's room after the murder to ensure that the lighting was perfect for the discovery. She wanted the scene to look like a painting, a final and aesthetic tribute to a life she had just ended with a piece of heavy cord and a cold heart. This psychological need for order and beauty, even in the middle of a slaughter, was the most disturbing part of the official case file. Marguerite Steinhell was eventually brought to trial in 1909, a media circus that captivated the entire nation and exposed the deep rot within the French aristocracy. Despite the overwhelming evidence of her involvement and the testimony of the household staff, she was at last acquitted by a jury that seemed more interested in her past scandals than her present crimes. She walked out of the courtroom a free woman, her silk dress rustling as she left the building. In the year 2026, the Steinhell case remains a foundational study in French law regarding the influence of social status and political blackmail on the outcome of criminal trials. Marguerite lived until 1954, taking the final truth of that night on Rue de l'Impasse to her grave in a quiet corner of England, where she had fled to escape her past. The blue silk knots are still kept in a police museum, a quiet reminder of a widow who was too smart to stay tied. The silk knots of a Parisian salon carry the cold weight of a legacy built on betrayal and the silent death of those who were supposed to be loved by their family. This same sense of a deep and ancient secret being held in place by metal and earth was waiting halfway across the world in the humid ground of Indochine. We leave the stone mansions of France and travel to the busy streets of Churlone in 1904, where a shovel was about to hit something chained shut. In the early months of 1904, a laborer named Min swung his heavy pickaxe into the soft, red clay of a drainage trench in the Cholon district of Saigon. The sun was a dull copper disk in the humid sky, casting a heavy and oppressive heat over the thousands of workers who were reshaping the city. He felt the metal tip of his tool strike something that did not sound like stone or the roots of an ancient banyan tree. It was a sharp, ringing vibration of metal hitting metal that traveled up the wooden handle and stung the palms of his hands. Min was a man who measured his life by the number of baskets of earth he could carry before the evening bell rang across the crowded markets of the district. He spent his mornings at a small noodle stall near the canal, enjoying the steam from his bowl while he watched the heavily laden sampans move through the brown water. He lived in a world of physical effort and small rewards, focused on the few coins he could send back to his mother in the northern countryside. His dreams were as simple and sturdy as the bamboo pole he used to carry his loads. He had spent the previous evening sitting on a low wooden stool outside his communal lodging, carefully mending a tear in his only spare pair of cotton trousers with a bone needle. The air had been filled with the scent of jasmine and the distant, rhythmic clatter of a printing press in a nearby shop. He worked with a quiet and focused patience, ensuring that every stitch was tight and even so that the garment would last through the coming monsoon season. This small act of maintenance was the last quiet moment of his week before the ground revealed its secret. Before leaving for the construction site that morning, Min had paused to light a single stick of incense at a small neighborhood shrine dedicated to the guardians of the earth. He bowed his head and asked for a day of steady work and a body that would not fail him under the weight of the heavy clay. He watched the thin blue smoke rise into the still air, unaware that the guardians he was praying to were already waiting for him just a few feet beneath the surface of the busy street. He adjusted his straw hat and walked toward the trench with a steady and rhythmic gait. Cholon was a city of deep shadows and ancient loyalties that existed right beneath the thin veneer of the French colonial administration. In the tea houses and the back alleys, men spoke in whispers about the Tien Dia Hoi, a secret society that governed the lives of the Chinese and Vietnamese residents with an iron hand. They collected taxes, settled disputes, and enforced a code of silence that was far more powerful than any law written in Paris. Everyone in the district knew that some doors were never meant to be opened and some questions were never meant to be asked. A few years before Min began his excavation, 5 young men had vanished from a local gambling den near the waterfront in a single evening. They were porters and street vendors who had been seen laughing and sharing a bottle of rice wine before they stepped out into the humid night and were never seen again. No one in the community had dared to file a formal report with the French police, knowing that the secret society did not tolerate interference in its internal matters. Their absence became a quiet fact of life, a gap in the fabric of the neighborhood that no one mentioned. Min dropped to his knees in the mud and began to clear the dirt away with his bare hands, his fingers brushing against a cold and jagged surface. As the clay fell away, he saw the link of a massive iron chain, its surface pitted with rust, but its structure still remarkably solid and heavy. He followed the line of the metal into the earth and realized that it was not lying flat, but was instead wrapped around something that stood perfectly upright in the narrow trench. He called out to his foreman, his voice sounding thin and brittle in the vast and noisy expanse. The excavation slowed to a halt as the other workers gathered around the edge of the pit, their faces pale under the shadows of their hats as the true nature of the discovery emerged. They found 5 sets of human remains, all of them positioned vertically in the earth as if they were standing at attention in a silent row. Each set of bones was linked to the next by a single, continuous iron chain that had been padlocked around their necks. The chain was so heavy that it had compressed the vertebrae of the men into a single fused column of bone and rusted metal. The links of the chain were not factory-made, but were instead hand-forged with a specific and irregular texture that showed the marks of a hammer and a high heat. One detail that stands out is that each link was engraved with a single character from an ancient dialect that described the duty of a sentinel who never sleeps. It is a very specific type of craftsmanship that suggests a ritual purpose rather than a simple act of criminal violence. The metal was designed to last for centuries in the damp soil, ensuring that the connection between the 5 men would never be broken. The French authorities arrived within the hour, led by a colonial inspector who viewed the discovery as a grisly curiosity of the local culture, rather than a crime to be solved. He stood at the edge of the trench and smoked a cigarette, his eyes scanning the vertical burials with a look of detached clinical interest. He ordered his men to document the positions of the skeletons, but he made no effort to identify the victims or to determine the date of their death. To the administration, these were just more nameless ghosts in a land that was already full of them in the heat. You are leaning into the dark trench, the smell of damp earth and old iron filling your lungs, and you realize that the men beneath your feet did not fall into this hole. They were lowered into the ground while they were still breathing, their feet touching the bottom as the first shovelful of dirt hit their shoulders. You feel the weight of the chain around your own neck, a cold and inescapable pressure that links your fate to the strangers standing beside you in the dark. The sound of the busy street above you feels like it belongs to a world that has already forgotten you exist. As the police pulled the skeletons from the earth, they realized that the men had been buried with their hands tied behind their backs with the same blue silk that was common in the secret society rituals. This suggested that the 5 men were not victims of a random attack, but were chosen for a specific and dark purpose within the Team Diahoy hierarchy. A local elder whispered to Min that these were the guardians of the Foundation, men who were sacrificed to ensure that a secret hoard of gold or a sacred site remained protected by their lingering spirits. The Team Diahoy believed that a vertical burial with an iron chain would bind the souls of the deceased to the physical location, creating a spiritual barrier that no intruder could cross. The men were effectively turned into eternal sentries, their presence in the soil serving as a warning to any who would attempt to dig in that specific area. This practice was a remnant of an older world of belief, where the cost of security was measured in human lives and the weight of a rusted chain. The gold they were guarding was never found, despite the extensive digging of the French. Min watched as the bones were placed into rough wooden crates and loaded onto a cart to be taken to a local cemetery for a nameless burial in the potter's field. He felt a deep and unsettling connection to the 5 men, knowing that he had been the one to disturb their long watch and break the silent contract they had with the earth. He wiped the red clay from his hands, but the stain seemed to have worked its way deep into his skin, a permanent reminder of the moment he hit the metal. He did not return to the construction site the following day or any day after. The investigation into the Chain 5 was officially closed within a week. The records filed away in a basement archive where they were eventually consumed by dampness and the insects of the tropics. No names were ever attached to the remains, and the Tiandiahoy never officially acknowledged the existence of the ritual or the identity of the men who were sacrificed. The story became a local legend, a cautionary tale told to children about the dangers of wandering too close to the construction sites of the growing city at night. The chain was melted down and forgotten by the law. The central human factor in this tragedy was the absolute and terrifying power of a secret society to claim the lives of its members for a symbolic purpose that the victims likely believed in themselves. These 5 men may have walked into that trench willingly, believing that their sacrifice would protect their families or their brothers in the society from a greater harm. This level of devotion is something that the modern mind struggles to comprehend, yet it was the foundation of the justice and the order that governed the shadows of Cholan in 1904 for the people. In the year 2026, the intersection in the district where the men were found is a bustling center of commerce, filled with the sound of motorbikes and the neon lights of modern shops. There is no plaque or marker to indicate that 5 men are still technically on watch beneath the pavement, their spirits having been woven into the history of the city itself. The crates containing their bones were lost during the various wars of the 20th century, leaving no physical trace of the Chain 5 for modern forensic scientists to examine with their new tools. The location is now part of a vibrant urban district, but the files on the discovery remain a cold reminder of a time when the ground was used as a safe for more than just gold. I think about the weight of that iron and how much of our world is built on top of secrets that were intended to be kept forever by people who had no voice of their own. It is a dark irony that the very progress that Min was working to build was the thing that finally exposed the cost of the old world's silence. We are all walking over something we do not understand. The story of the Chained 5 leaves us with a heavy realization that the history of a place is not just written in the books or the monuments, but is held in the very soil beneath our feet. It teaches us that the structures of power and belief can be just as unyielding as iron, and that the shadows of the past never truly disappear. They just wait for a shovel to find them. We are left to wonder how many other sentinels are still standing at attention in the dark, waiting for someone to notice the ringing of metal against a pickaxe. As we end our journey through these 10 stories of the early 20th century, the rain continues to fall against the glass, a steady and indifferent rhythm that has watched over all these events as they unfolded. Whether it was a locked room in Tokyo or a chain in a Saigon trench, the world has a way of absorbing our mysteries and turning them into the quiet dust of the future. I hope these stories stay with you tonight as you drift off, a reminder that the dark is not empty, it is just waiting for the light to move on. Take a moment to listen to the rain and feel the comfort of your own bed, knowing that your door is locked and the world outside is at a safe distance from your thoughts. If you enjoyed this long walk into the shadows of 1900 to 1910, remember to subscribe and leave a comment about which story felt the heaviest to you tonight. There is a strange kind of peace in knowing the truth of these events, even if the answers are still buried deep in the earth. Sleep well, and I will see you the next time the shadows grow long.